The year was 1772. On a cold October morning, the church bells of Boston rang longer than usual, not for celebration, not for prayer, but for another burial. By the time the sun reached the rooftops of the Harbor District, a plain wooden coffin was already being lowered into the soil behind St. Mercy General Hospital. No name was carved into the marker. No family gathered around the grave, just a priest, 2 hospital attendants, and a grave that had been dug the night before. The priest whispered the final prayer quickly, almost mechanically. The attendants avoided eye contact with one another. Because this was the 3rd burial that week, no one wanted to ask the question, forming quietly across the town. Why were so many patients dying inside St. Mercy General Hospital? First, people assumed the worst that colonial life had always delivered: disease, infection, God's judgment. Colonial America in the mid-18th century was a world where death was common and medicine was primitive. Physicians worked without anesthesia, without modern sterilization, and often without formal training. Hospitals themselves were rare institutions. Many communities still relied on home remedies, church healers, and traveling surgeons. But St. Mercy General Hospital was supposed to be different. It had been built with noble intentions, funded by wealthy merchants, supported by the local Anglican clergy, and praised by the colonial government as a symbol of progress in the American colonies. It stood just outside Boston's crowded center, near the harbor road that carried trade ships between Massachusetts Bay and London. The building itself was impressive for its time. 3 stone floors, tall windows, a chapel attached to the eastern wing, and a promise carved into the entrance arch: mercy in body and soul. For the first few years, the hospital earned its reputation. Sailors injured at sea were treated there. Farmers with broken bones were carried in by wagon. Mothers struggling in childbirth sought help from its physicians. The people of Boston believed St. Mercy was a place where science and faith worked together, a place where suffering might be eased, a place where God's mercy could still be found in a brutal century. But something changed, quietly, slowly, and almost no one noticed at first. The records began with small numbers: 2 unexplained deaths in 1756, 4 more in 1757, then 7 the following year. Each death listed under familiar causes of the era: fever, consumption, internal bleeding, sudden decline. In the 1700s, those explanations rarely raised suspicion. Doctors had limited understanding of disease. The colonies had no centralized medical oversight, and hospital records were often written by hand, locked away in church offices, and rarely reviewed. But over time, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern that no one outside the hospital seemed to notice. Patients admitted with minor injuries. Patients expected to recover. Patients who, within days, became mysteriously worse, and then died. By 1764, the burial ground behind St. Mercy had expanded twice. A second row of unmarked graves had been added along the back wall of the chapel, and still the hospital continued to operate. Doctors continued their work, priests continued their prayers, and wagons continued arriving at the gates carrying the sick. But whispers began circulating among the harbor workers, among the nurses who changed the linens, among the attendants who carried bodies to the cemetery after sunset. They began asking the same question. Why did patients rarely leave St. Mercy alive? One nurse in particular noticed something troubling. Her name was Elizabeth Harrow. Elizabeth had arrived in Boston in 1768, the daughter of a small-town minister from Connecticut. She was educated enough to read Latin medical texts, unusual for women in colonial America. She believed deeply in the mission of the hospital: healing the sick, serving God, helping the poor. At first, she accepted the deaths as unfortunate but normal. But after her first year inside St. Mercy, Elizabeth began keeping her own notes. Not official hospital records. It's just quiet observations in a small leather journal she hid beneath her mattress. She wrote down patient names, their symptoms, which doctor treated them, what happened afterward. At the time, she didn't know she was documenting something terrifying, because the numbers kept growing. By 1772, Elizabeth had counted something no one else had bothered to calculate: 213 deaths. In just 16 years? And many of those patients had not been dying when they arrived. Some had entered the hospital walking, speaking hopeful, and within days, they were gone. Elizabeth wasn't the only one who noticed. A local printer named Samuel Whitaker had begun hearing rumors from dock workers. Rumors that sailors avoided St. Mercy, rumors that some families refused to send their relatives there, even during severe illness. Rumors that something unnatural was happening behind the hospital's stone walls. Whitaker was a cautious man. In colonial America, accusations against religious institutions could destroy reputations or even lead to imprisonment. But curiosity pushed him to investigate. And when he requested access to the hospital's mortality records, something strange happened. His request was denied, immediately, without explanation. That refusal only deepened the mystery. Hospitals in the colonies rarely guarded records so aggressively, especially not small charitable institutions. But St. Mercy suddenly behaved like a fortress. Doctors refused interviews. Clergy dismissed the rumors as gossip. The hospital board warned that spreading fear could harm the spiritual mission of the institution. Yet the deaths continued, quietly, relentlessly, one coffin at a time. Inside the hospital, Elizabeth Harrow's private journal was filling with disturbing patterns. Patients treated by certain physicians died more often than others. Some rooms had nearly perfect survival rates. Others seemed cursed. She also noticed something else. Late at night, certain doctors entered the ward after prayers had ended. They brought small glass vials, metal instruments, and sometimes no nurses were allowed to assist them. When Elizabeth once asked a senior physician about these nighttime procedures, she was given a cold answer. "These are advanced treatments," he said. Beyond your understanding, that physician's name was Dr. Nathaniel Crowe. He had arrived at St. Mercy in 1763 after studying medicine in London. Tall, reserved, exceptionally respected, Crowe quickly became one of the hospital's leading surgeons. His education overseas made him valuable in a time when few colonial doctors had formal training. But Elizabeth noticed something unsettling about him. He rarely showed emotion, spoke little to patients, and the majority of unexplained deaths seemed to follow his treatments. Still, suspicion alone meant nothing. In 1770s colonial America, challenging a respected physician could destroy a woman's reputation, especially a nurse, especially one working under church authority. Elizabeth knew the risk, but she also knew something else. If her numbers were correct, then the hospital was not simply unlucky. Something was happening inside St. Mercy. Something deliberate. Outside the hospital walls, colonial America was already simmering with tension. The British Crown was tightening control over the colonies. Taxes had sparked protests. Political pamphlets circulated through Boston's taverns. Just 2 years earlier, the Boston Massacre had shocked the city and deepened mistrust of authority. People were beginning to question institutions they once obeyed without hesitation: government, military, and even the church. But few imagined that one of the darkest secrets in Boston might not involve politics or war. It might involve a hospital, a place meant to heal. Elizabeth continued writing in her journal. Carefully, quietly, she recorded dates, symptoms, treatments, deaths, and gradually, her notes began pointing toward a horrifying possibility. What if the deaths were not accidents? What if they were experiments? But proving something like that in the 18th century would be nearly impossible. There were no forensic labs, investigative journalism as we know it today, no medical licensing boards, only handwritten records, rumors, and courage. Elizabeth Harrow would need all three, because if she was right, the deaths at St. Mercy were not the result of disease. They were the result of something far darker. And the man at the center of it all was Dr. Nathaniel Crowe. But before we uncover what truly happened inside those stone walls, before we reveal the horrifying pattern hidden in Elizabeth Harrow's journal, there's something important you should know. Stories like this rarely appear in textbooks. They exist in forgotten letters, buried archives, and records that history almost erased. You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If you're drawn to the forgotten mysteries of the past, the conspiracies hidden inside religious institutions, and the disturbing truths that official history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Darkness, like this video, and share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, because the deeper we dig into the past, the more secrets we uncover, But before we continue, we want to hear from you. After hearing these early clues, what do you think was happening at St. Mercy General Hospital? Was it simply the tragic limits of 18th century medicine? Or was something far more sinister unfolding behind those chapel doors? Let us know your theory in the comments. Your ideas might uncover something others missed, because in part 2 we'll go deeper. We'll explore the hospital's hidden treatment rooms, the mysterious nighttime procedures, and the shocking discovery Elizabeth Harrow made inside the physician's wing. A discovery that would risk her career, her reputation, possibly her life. And when the truth about 213 deaths in 16 years finally begins to surface, it will expose one of the darkest medical secrets in colonial America. Part 2 begins with a locked door inside St. Mercy's General Hospital, and what Elizabeth Harrow found behind it. The lanterns inside St. Mercy General Hospital burned low after midnight. Colonial hospitals did not operate with the constant light and noise of modern medicine. When evening prayers ended and the chapel bells fell silent, most wards drifted into darkness. Only a few oil lamps remained lit in the hallways, their weak glow stretching across stone floors and timber beams. Beyond the walls of the hospital, the city of Boston slept beneath the cold Atlantic wind. Ships creaked in the harbor. Dock workers drank in candlelit taverns. And somewhere beyond the harbor road, British soldiers stood guard over a colony already simmering with unrest after the violence of the Boston Massacre. But inside St. Mercy, another kind of tension lived in the shadows, the kind that never appeared in sermons, or government records, or polite conversation. Elizabeth Harrow felt it every night. She had worked at the hospital for 4 years now, long enough to understand its rhythms, long enough to recognize when something did not belong. And tonight, something did not belong. She stood alone in the second-floor corridor, clutching a lantern and her leather journal. Most of the patients were asleep. A man recovering from a broken leg snored loudly behind one door. Across the hall, a young sailor with fever murmured in restless dreams. Elizabeth had checked them all during her rounds. Everything was normal, except for one thing. The light beneath a door at the end of the corridor. The physician's wing. Ordinarily locked after evening prayers. Ordinarily silent until morning. But tonight, warm yellow light slipped through the crack beneath the door. And Elizabeth knew exactly whose office stood beyond it. Dr. Nathaniel Crowe. Crowe had become one of the most powerful figures inside St. Mercy. When he arrived from London nearly a decade earlier, the hospital's board had welcomed him as a symbol of progress. A physician trained in Europe brought prestige to a colonial institution that otherwise struggled for credibility. His connections were impressive. London medical societies, Anglican church leaders, colonial administrators who saw modern medicine as proof that the American colonies were advancing toward the sophistication of Europe. Crowe understood that power, and he used it well. Within a few years of his arrival, he had gained control over nearly every important decision inside the hospital. New equipment purchases, treatment procedures, patient admissions, even the hospital's burial records. All passed through his authority. To most people in Boston, this seemed reasonable. After all, Crowe was educated, disciplined, and remarkably successful in performing difficult surgeries. But Elizabeth had seen another side of him, a colder one. She had noticed it during operations. Crowe did not treat patients like suffering human beings. He studied them, measured them, observed their reactions with a detached curiosity that unsettled even experienced nurses. Sometimes he ordered procedures no one else in the hospital fully understood. Procedures performed late at night, without witnesses, without explanation. Elizabeth approached the glowing door slowly. Her footsteps echoed softly in the hallway. She hesitated. The hospital had strict rules about entering physician offices. Breaking them could cost her position. But her journal weighed heavily in her pocket. 213 deaths, 16 years. The numbers were impossible to ignore. She pressed her ear against the door. At first, she heard nothing. Then, the faint scratching of a pen. Someone writing. Elizabeth turned the brass handle carefully. The door was locked. That alone was unusual. Doctors rarely locked their offices. This was a charitable hospital, not a government vault. But Crowe treated his workspace like a private fortress. Elizabeth stepped back. Her heart beat faster now. If Crowe was inside, she could not risk being caught. But curiosity had already taken hold. Something else had begun to form in her mind. A question she had never dared to ask before. What exactly was Dr. Crowe hiding? The answer might not be inside the office itself, but perhaps nearby. Elizabeth moved down the hallway toward the staircase. The physician's wing was built differently than the rest of the hospital. Most of St. Mercy followed the simple architecture common in colonial buildings: narrow halls, wooden doors, small patient rooms. But the physician's area contained something unusual: a second staircase. When not used by nurses or patients, it led down to the lower level, the hospital basement. Few staff members ever entered the basement. It held storage rooms for medical supplies, linens, and preserved herbs shipped from Europe, barrels of alcohol used for cleaning wounds, crates of surgical tools. But Elizabeth had heard rumors from one of the older attendants, rumors about another room down there, a room built years after the hospital's original construction, a room that appeared suddenly on the architectural records without explanation. Elizabeth lit her lantern brighter and began descending the narrow staircase. Each wooden step creaked under her weight. The air grew colder as she moved deeper underground. The smell of vinegar and dried herbs filled the corridor. The basement hallway was darker than the upper floors. Stone walls dripped with moisture. Wooden beams supported the hospital above, like the ribs of a massive skeleton. Elizabeth had only been down here once before. During her first week at St. Mercy, a senior nurse had warned her then. "Stay out of the far storage rooms," the woman whispered. "Doctors handle things there." At the time, Elizabeth had assumed the warning referred to unpleasant surgical work. Now she wondered if it meant something else entirely. She moved slowly through the corridor. Her lantern illuminated shelves stacked with glass jars. Some contained preserved organs used for medical study. Others held powders and liquids imported from European pharmacies. Colonial medicine depended heavily on such substances. Quinine from South America, opium extracts from trade ships, mercury compounds used in treatments that often harmed patients more than they helped. But none of those explained the deaths in Elizabeth's journal. She reached the far end of the basement and stopped, because the rumors were true. Doors stood where no door should have been. Heavy oak, iron hinges, and a lock far more complex than any used elsewhere in the hospital. Elizabeth raised her lantern. Something was nailed beside the door. A paper notice, written in Latin. She could read enough Latin to understand the first line. Experimentum vita, experiment of life. Her pulse quickened. Hospitals in the 1700s did perform medical experiments, but rarely in secret, and rarely inside religious institutions. The Anglican Church maintained strict oversight of medical ethics within its hospitals. Any unusual treatments were supposed to be documented and approved by clergy authorities. Yet Elizabeth had never heard this room mentioned in any hospital meeting. She examined the lock. It required a key likely carried by only one person in the building, Dr. Nathaniel Crowe. But as Elizabeth stepped closer, something caught her attention. A narrow gap between the door and the stone wall. Not large, just enough to allow a faint line of light to escape. Her breath stopped. Someone was inside. She leaned closer, careful not to let her lantern cast shadows under the door. At first she heard nothing. Then, voices. Two men speaking quietly. One voice she recognized immediately, Dr. Crowe. The other voice was unfamiliar, older, calmer, and carrying an accent Elizabeth could not immediately place. She strained to hear their conversation. The stone walls muffled most of the words, but a few sentences reached her clearly. "The trials are progressing faster than expected," Crowe said. "The subjects are responding well." "Subjects, not patients. Subjects," the older voice responded slowly. "The Crown expects results soon. London grows impatient." Elizabeth froze. The Crown. British officials. What possible interest could the British government have in experiments at a small colonial hospital? Crowe continued. "We must expand the intake. The current number of subjects is insufficient." Elizabeth's hands trembled. The word echoed in her mind. Intake. Subjects' trials. Then she heard something else. A sound from inside the room. Not voices, not footsteps. Something weaker. A human voice. Barely audible. A patient whispering, or perhaps crying. Elizabeth stepped back from the door. Her thoughts raced. If people were being used for experiments inside St. Mercy, then the deaths in her journal were not accidents. They were part of something organized, something deliberate. But before she could move, the voices inside the room suddenly stopped. Silence filled the basement corridor, then footsteps, approaching the door. Elizabeth's heart slammed against her ribs. She extinguished her lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the hallway. The iron lock on the door began to turn. Elizabeth Harrow realized something terrifying. She was about to come face to face with the man responsible for 213 deaths. But the truth she was about to discover would be far worse than she imagined. Because hidden inside that basement room, Elizabeth would soon find documents proving that the deaths at St. Mercy were not merely the work of one doctor. They were part of a secret program, funded by powerful figures, protected by the church, and possibly connected to the highest authorities of the British Crown itself. What Elizabeth Harrow discovers next will change everything. Elizabeth Harrow pressed herself into the darkness of the basement corridor. The lantern in her hand had gone cold. The hallway around her was now swallowed by shadow. Only a thin strip of light glowed beneath the heavy oak door. On the other side of that door, the lock was turning. The metal mechanism clicked slowly, deliberately. Elizabeth's breath became shallow. If the door opened fully, the light would spill into the corridor and reveal her immediately. There was nowhere to hide. No side room, no supply cabinet. Only stone walls and darkness. The lock turned again, then stopped. For a moment nothing happened. Elizabeth held perfectly still, not even daring to swallow. And then, footsteps moved away from the door. The voices resumed, fainter now. Crowe and the older man had moved deeper into the room. Elizabeth didn't understand why the door hadn't opened. Perhaps they had only checked the lock, or perhaps someone inside had grown suspicious. Either possibility meant the same thing. She could not stay here. Carefully, Elizabeth began stepping backward along the basement wall. Her fingers traced the cold stone surface as she moved. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness. Her breathing, her shoes against the floor. The faint echo of voices behind the locked door. She reached the corner of the hallway and paused.
Hi.
The staircase leading back to the hospital wards was just ahead. But something stopped her. A sound, not from behind. From above. Footsteps. Someone was moving through the hospital corridors overhead. Slow, measured, and far too late for a routine patrol. Elizabeth felt a strange unease tighten in her chest. Because the footsteps didn't move like those of a tired night attendant. They paused, then moved again, as if someone was searching. She climbed the staircase carefully. Each step creaked softly beneath her weight. Halfway up she stopped. As the footsteps above it stopped too. The silence stretched for several seconds, long enough for Elizabeth to wonder if the person upstairs had heard her, or worse, was waiting. She reached the top of the staircase and cracked open the door leading to the physician's hallway. The corridor was dim. 2 oil lamps flickered against the walls. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and medicine. But the hallway appeared empty. Elizabeth stepped out slowly. Her eyes scanned the corridor. Doors closed. Patient rooms quiet. No movement. Yet something felt wrong. Not visibly wrong, but wrong in the way the air felt. Heavy, watchful. She turned toward the nurses' quarters. If she returned to her room now, no one would question her presence in the hallway. But halfway down the corridor she stopped again, because something on the wall had changed. A door. One she passed every night. The storage room beside Dr. Crowe's office. Tonight it stood slightly open. Elizabeth was certain it had been closed earlier. She remembered checking it during her rounds. Now a narrow crack revealed darkness inside. She stepped closer, her heart pounding again. Something about the room disturbed her instinctively, as if it had been opened deliberately, as if someone wanted it noticed. She pushed the door gently. The hinges creaked. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stacked with linens and medical supplies. But one object on the table immediately caught her attention. A folded piece of paper. Elizabeth entered the room and closed the door behind her. She picked up the paper. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as if written by someone in fear. The message contained only 3 lines. "You're being watched. They know about the journal. Stop before you become a subject." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Her journal. The small leather notebook hidden beneath her mattress. No one was supposed to know it existed. She had never mentioned it to anyone. Not even the other nurses. Yet someone clearly knew, and had left a warning. Elizabeth read the message again. The handwriting looked familiar. but she could not immediately place it. Then a chilling possibility formed in her mind. The note might not be from an enemy. It might be from someone inside the hospital. Someone who had already seen too much. Sudden noise outside the storage room made her freeze. Footsteps again, approaching the door. Elizabeth quickly folded the note and slipped it into her sleeve. The footsteps stopped just outside. A shadow moved beneath the door. For several seconds, the figure did not move, just stood there, listening. Elizabeth held her breath. The air inside the room felt suffocating. If the door opened now, there would be no explanation for her presence here. The handle shifted slightly, not enough to open, just enough to test whether the door was locked. Then the shadow moved away. Footsteps faded down the hallway. Elizabeth waited nearly a full minute before opening the door again. The corridor was empty once more. But now the hospital felt completely different. Not like a place of healing, like a place under surveillance. Someone knew she was investigating. Someone had discovered her journal, and someone had chosen to warn her. But the warning itself raised another terrifying question. If the deaths were connected to the secret room in the basement, and if people were being used as subjects, then what happened to those who became inconvenient? Elizabeth returned quickly to the nurse's quarters. Her room was small, just a bed, a wooden chair, and a narrow window overlooking the chapel courtyard. She locked the door and pulled her journal from beneath the mattress. The pages were exactly as she left them. Patient names, dates, symptoms, Crowe's treatments, deaths. But now, looking at the list again, she noticed something new. Something she had overlooked before. Several patients had not died immediately after treatment. Some had disappeared from the records entirely. No burial entry, no discharge record, no explanation. Elizabeth turned back several pages, then several more. Her heart began beating faster, because the pattern repeated. At least 7 patients were missing from the hospital logs, vanished from the records completely. Where had they gone? The answer came to her slowly, like a terrible realization rising from the depths of memory. The basement room, the locked door, the voices discussing subjects. Those patients had not died. They had been taken. Elizabeth closed the journal and stared at the wall. The hospital suddenly felt like a prison. She was inside it. Outside her window, the chapel bell rang once. The signal for early morning prayers. Dawn was approaching. Soon the hospital would wake. Doctors would begin their rounds, and Dr. Nathaniel Crowe would walk the halls again. But Elizabeth was no longer the only one watching, because somewhere inside St. Mercy, someone else had noticed the same pattern. Someone who had written the warning. Someone who might know far more than she did. And that person had just risked their life to send a message. Elizabeth unfolded the note again. This time she studied the handwriting carefully. The loops, the angles, the uneven pressure of the ink. Then suddenly, recognition struck. She had seen this handwriting before. Not in a journal, not in a patient record, in a letter. One stored inside Dr. Crowe's office. A letter signed by the hospital's chief administrator, Reverend Jonathan Hale, the man responsible for overseeing the hospital on behalf of the Anglican Church. The man who approved all of Crowe's experiments. The man who publicly defended the hospital whenever rumors spread. If Hale had written the warning, then something inside St. Mercy had begun to fracture, which meant Elizabeth might not be alone anymore. But it also meant something else, something far more dangerous. If Reverend Hale was warning her secretly, then Dr. Nathaniel Crowe might already suspect him. And in a place where people disappeared from records, suspicion could be fatal. Elizabeth folded the note carefully and hid it inside her journal, and she looked toward the physician's wing, toward the locked office of Dr. Nathaniel Crowe, because now she understood something important. The basement room was only part of the secret, the real truth. The documents explaining the experiments, the names of the missing patients, they were probably hidden somewhere inside Crowe's office. And tomorrow night, Elizabeth Harrow intended to break into it. She had no idea that someone else inside St. Mercy was already preparing for that exact moment. Someone who had been watching her for days, waiting. And when Elizabeth finally opened the door to Crowe's office, she would not be alone. Morning arrived slowly over the harbor of Boston. Gray mist rolled across the water, wrapping the masts of merchant ships in fog. Dock workers shouted to one another as they unloaded cargo from vessels arriving from London. Barrels of molasses, Crates of textiles and bundles of medical supplies moved from ship decks onto the muddy streets of the Colonial port. Boston was a city built on trade, faith, and quiet tension. By the early 1770s, the colony lived under the shadow of British authority. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Newspapers carried arguments about taxation and loyalty to the crown, and still, life continued. Church bells rang, markets opened. Children ran through narrow streets between timber houses. But behind the walls of St. Mercy General Hospital, something darker continued to unfold. Elizabeth Harrow had not slept. The warning note remained hidden inside her journal, tucked beneath the loose floorboard beneath her bed. The message repeated itself inside her mind like a whispered prayer. You are being watched. They know about the journal. Stop before you become a subject. Yet even after reading those words again and again, Elizabeth felt something strange. Fear was there, certainly, but something stronger had begun to rise above it. Resolve. To understand Elizabeth's decision that morning, you have to understand who she truly was. Not just a nurse in a colonial hospital, but a woman shaped by the world she grew up in. Elizabeth Harrow was born in 1750 in a small village in Connecticut. Her father was a minister, a strict man who believed deeply in scripture, discipline, and the moral responsibilities of knowledge. Unlike many fathers of the time, he believed his daughter should be educated. So Elizabeth learned to read before she was 6, Latin before she was 12, and by 16 she could read basic medical texts used by colonial physicians. This was unusual in the 18th century. Women rarely received formal education beyond household skills, but Elizabeth's father believed something else. Truth mattered, and knowledge revealed it. That belief became Elizabeth's greatest strength and her greatest weakness, because once she began seeing patterns inside St. Mercy, she could not pretend they were accidents. Yet Elizabeth was not fearless. She understood the power structures around her. The hospital was not simply a place of healing. It was part of a much larger network. Church authority, colonial governance, British medical influence. Challenging that system could destroy her life. Or worse, that was the moral conflict burning inside her. Should she expose the truth and risk everything, or remain silent and survive? Across the hospital courtyard, another man faced his own moral framework, Dr. Nathaniel Crowe. Crowe had been born decades earlier in England, the son of a wealthy merchant family. He studied medicine in London during a time when European science was beginning to challenge centuries of religious doctrine. Physicians were experimenting with new treatments, new theories about disease, new ideas about the human body, but many of those ideas required experimentation, and experimentation required subjects. In Europe, such work often happened quietly, behind closed doors, with patients who had little power to refuse. Crowe believed this was necessary. To him, medicine was not merely a profession, it was a mission, a race against death itself. He had once written something in a letter to a colleague in London, a sentence that revealed the foundation of his thinking. Progress in medicine is written in blood, long before it is written in textbooks. Crowe did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as a pioneer, someone willing to cross moral boundaries that others feared, and someone willing to sacrifice a few lives to save thousands in the future. To Crowe, the deaths at St. Mercy were not crimes. They were data. But even Crowe understood one thing. Colonial society was not ready for such thinking. The Anglican Church demanded moral restraint. Hospital donors demanded compassion. Patients expected healing, it's not experimentation. So Crowe built his work in secrecy, and he built alliances with powerful men who shared his vision. One of those men was Reverend Jonathan Hale. Hale had once been Crowe's strongest supporter, a respected Anglican administrator who oversaw the hospital's operations. To the public, he appeared compassionate and deeply religious. He spoke about mercy in sermons, about healing as God's work, about charity as a Christian duty. But Hale was also a practical man. He understood the importance of scientific advancement, and he understood something else. The British Crown wanted results. During the late 18th century, Britain's military campaigns stretched across the world. From Europe to the Caribbean to the American colonies, disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Fever, infection, gangrene, Medical breakthroughs could change the balance of empire. And Crowe promised such breakthroughs. At first, Hale believed in that promise. He approved Crowe's research. He helped hide the basement laboratory. He signed documents that allowed certain patients to be transferred without official records. But as the years passed, the numbers grew. Too many deaths, too many disappearances, too many experiments without clear success. And slowly, Reverend Hale began to question what they had created. That was the emotional fracture now forming inside St. Mercy. Loyalty versus conscience. Progress versus morality. Faith versus ambition. Around them, the supporting characters of the hospital lived within their own quiet fears. Nurses who suspected something was wrong, but feared unemployment. Attendants who carried bodies to the cemetery but asked no questions. Young physicians who admired Crowe's brilliance, yet avoided the basement corridors. Each person sensed the darkness. But no one wanted to be the first to challenge it, until Elizabeth Harrow. Her discovery of the missing patients had shifted something fundamental. The hospital was no longer simply hiding deaths. It was hiding living people, subjects, human beings used for experiments. And now, the warning note revealed something even more shocking. Reverend Hale himself might be turning against the system he helped create. Elizabeth sat quietly in the nurses' quarters that afternoon, watching the sunlight fade across the courtyard. Patients moved slowly through the hospital halls. Doctors made their rounds. Life continued as usual. But beneath that routine, a silent battle was forming. Elizabeth versus Crowe. Truth versus power. Conscience versus ambition. And somewhere in the middle, Reverend Hale, a man whose loyalties were no longer clear. As evening approached, Elizabeth made her decision, not driven by anger, not by fear, but by the belief her father had taught her long ago. Truth mattered. If Crowe's office contained records of the experiments, then those records could expose everything. The deaths, the missing patients, the secret basement laboratory, the connection to powerful figures beyond the hospital walls. But breaking into the office would mean crossing a point of no return. If Crowe discovered her actions, there would be no forgiveness, no second chance. Elizabeth stood by the window and watched the sun disappear behind the chapel roof. Night was coming, and with it, opportunity. She reached beneath the floorboard and retrieved her journal. Then she unfolded the warning note one last time. The handwriting of Reverend Hale stared back at her, silent confession. A secret alliance, or perhaps a trap. Elizabeth folded the note carefully and placed it inside her pocket. Then she whispered a quiet prayer, not for safety, but for courage. Because tonight, Elizabeth Harrow would enter Dr. Nathaniel Crowe's office, and once she crossed that threshold, the secrets of St. Mercy General Hospital would begin to surface, one document at a time, one horrifying truth after another, and there would be no turning back. Night had returned to Boston. The harbor winds carried the smell of salt and smoke through the narrow streets. Lanterns flickered outside taverns, and the distant creaking of ship masts echoed across the docks. But inside St. Mercy General Hospital, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Elizabeth Harrow stood in the shadowed corridor outside Dr. Nathaniel Crowe's office. Her heart beat slowly, deliberately. She had waited until the last chapel prayer ended, until the physicians returned to their quarters, until the hospital settled into the quiet rhythm of night. Now the hallway was nearly empty. Crowe's office door stood only a few feet away. Elizabeth had never entered the room before. Few nurses were allowed inside. Crowe kept his workspace private, claiming that complex medical research required concentration and order. But tonight, the door stood unlocked.
Out.
That alone was unsettling, almost as if someone expected her. She pushed the door open slowly. The hinges whispered against the frame. The office smelled faintly of ink and chemicals. Books filled the shelves, thick medical volumes imported from London. Glass jars lined the desk. Inside them floated preserved specimens used for study. Bones, organs, pieces of anatomy labeled in precise Latin script. But Elizabeth's eyes moved past them quickly, because something far more important waited on the desk, a locked wooden chest. The chest was not large, but it was reinforced with iron bands. Its keyhole showed signs of constant use. Elizabeth knelt beside it. Her hands trembled slightly. She had never stolen anything in her life. Yet tonight she was about to break into the most private archive inside the hospital. She reached into her pocket and removed the thin metal instrument she had borrowed from the surgical ward, a delicate probe used for wound examination. She had spent hours studying the hospital locks, practicing, learning. Now the moment had arrived. The tool slid carefully into the keyhole. Elizabeth turned it gently. The mechanism resisted at first, then shifted. A faint metallic click echoed through the room. The chest opened. Inside were dozens of documents, bundles of parchment tied with thin string, medical reports, patient lists, letters stamped with official seals. Elizabeth began reading quickly. At first the documents appeared like ordinary hospital records. Treatment notes, observations about fever, descriptions of surgical techniques. But the deeper she read, the more disturbing the truth became. Each entry labeled with a subject number instead of a patient name. Subject 34, Subject 41, Subject 52. Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten. These were not medical notes. They were experiment logs. Detailed observations about how the human body reacted to certain substances. New surgical methods, even deliberate infections designed to study disease progression. She turned another page, found something worse. A list of names. Real names. Men and women admitted to the hospital over the past decade. Next to each name was a mark. A small symbol written in red ink. The same symbol appeared beside the entries labeled subject. Elizabeth's breath caught. These were the missing patients. The ones who had vanished from the hospital records. They had not been discharged. They had been chosen. Chosen for experiments. Another document lay beneath the list. A letter, sealed with dark wax bearing the crest of the British crown. Elizabeth unfolded it slowly. Her eyes scanned the elegant handwriting. The letter spoke of medical progress, of the importance of developing treatments that could protect soldiers from infection and battlefield injuries. It praised Dr. Nathaniel Crowe's dedication to advancing British medical knowledge. And then it made something unmistakably clear. The experiments at St. Mercy were not rogue actions. They were funded, supported, and expected. Elizabeth leaned back in the chair, stunned. The conspiracy was far larger than she imagined. Crowe was not simply a rogue physician. He was part of a network stretching across the Atlantic, connecting colonial hospitals with the ambitions of the British Empire. Footsteps suddenly echoed in the hallway. Elizabeth froze. The office door was still open. Anyone walking past could see her inside. She quickly gathered several documents and hid them inside her apron. Then she closed the chest carefully. The lock clicked back into place. Footsteps passed the door. Slow, measured, but they did not stop. Elizabeth waited until the sound faded before exhaling again. What she had just discovered could destroy the hospital. It could expose Crowe. It could even implicate powerful authorities connected to the crown. But revealing it would also put Elizabeth in terrible danger, because now she knew the truth. And people who knew too much rarely survived long inside St. Mercy. The next morning, Boston awoke to something unexpected. A public sermon. Word spread quickly through the streets. Hale had called for an emergency gathering at the hospital chapel. Merchants, clergy, even colonial officials were invited. The announcement puzzled many people. Hale rarely held sermons outside the regular Sunday schedule. Calling one during the week meant something serious had happened. By mid-morning, the chapel pews were filled. Doctors sat together in stiff silence. Nurses lined the back wall. Patients who could walk gathered near the entrance. Outside, curious townspeople crowded the courtyard. Elizabeth stood among the nurses, clutching the documents hidden beneath her apron. Her heart pounded. She had not expected this. Why would Halleck call a public gathering now? Did he know she had entered Crowe's office, or was something else unfolding? Reverend Hale stepped onto the chapel platform. The room fell silent. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows behind him. For a moment, he looked older than Elizabeth remembered. More tired, as if carrying the weight of something unbearable. He opened his Bible slowly. Then he looked out across the crowd. "My friends," he began quietly. "Today I must speak about truth." The audience shifted uneasily. Doctors glanced at one another. Crowe sat near the front, his expression calm and unreadable. Hale continued, "There are times when institutions created for mercy can lose their way." Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. The room seemed to hold its breath. "When that happens," Hale said, "it becomes the duty of conscience to confront the darkness." Murmurs spread across the chapel. Crowe's eyes narrowed slightly. Hale raised a hand. "I have recently learned troubling information regarding the medical practices conducted within this hospital." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the hidden documents. Was Hallie about to expose everything? In front of the entire city? Crowe suddenly stood. The movement was sharp, controlled, but unmistakably defensive. "Reverend Hale," he said calmly, "perhaps this discussion would be better held privately." The tension in the room thickened. Every eye turned toward the two men. Hale did not sit down. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a folded sheet of parchment. Elizabeth's heart stopped, because she recognized the paper. It looked exactly like the document she had taken from Crowe's office. Hale held the parchment high. "My duty," he said, "is to reveal what has been hidden." Gasps rippled through the chapel. Crowe's face hardened. But before Hale could speak another word, the chapel doors burst open. Two British officers stepped inside, red coats bright against the dim church light. Behind them stood several armed soldiers. The entire room fell silent. One officer stepped forward and addressed the crowd. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of the crown. "Reverend Jonathan Hale," he announced, "you are under arrest for treason against the interests of the British Empire." Shock spread through the chapel like wildfire. Nurses gasped. Doctors whispered. Patients stared in disbelief. Elizabeth felt the world tilt beneath her feet, because the officer's next words were even more terrifying. "These medical experiments," he continued, "are sanctioned by the Crown." And then he pointed directly toward the back of the chapel. Toward Elizabeth Harrow. Seize her in that moment. Elizabeth realized something horrifying. The conspiracy was watching her all along, and now there was nowhere left to hide.